Welcome back, and a very special welcome to the man who is the chairman of the board of our Institute for the American Future. His name is Rod Martin. That is only one of his distinctions. He is the author of the Rod Martin Report, a wonderful online resource available to you at rodmartin.org. He was one of the PayPal mafia back when men were men. He has gone on to be a successful entrepreneur and capitalist, but he is prized by me and I think our audience because of his free-range mind. Really one of the great intellects of our time, public intellectual and all that. And we're delighted to have him always. Welcome back, Rod. Good to have you with us as ever. So I want to catch up with you on a couple of things. We've been talking in the course of the program about artificial intelligence, and I confess to being something of a Luddite about all of this, meaning not so keen on these kinds of technological possible monsters. I know you are a tech entrepreneur by avocation and training. Make us feel a little bit better about this possibility that we might see Franken AI emerging from sort of unchecked, unregulated competition with China.
Well, acknowledging all of the issues, I too have seen Terminator. I encourage everybody to watch The Matrix. There are clearly problems attendant to this, but one of them so far is not actual intelligence. Artificial, yes. Intelligent, no. And if you just experience the GPT-5 rollout, you know what I'm talking about. It's got basically the same limitations that 4.0 had a month ago, and that's frankly very frustrating. We were promised all this advance, and no, because they're hitting a limit. The reality is, as George Gilder has said unendingly, computation is not comprehension. And there is a very serious new pagan religion in Silicon Valley built around creating an artificial superintelligence that we're basically all going to obey and worship. And it's just not happening. Now, might it happen in the far future? Maybe. Might it happen in the mid-future? Probably not, but I guess it could. There's nothing they're doing right now that doesn't just enhance productivity with no possibility of taking over or anything like that.
Well, that's very heartening, I dare say. And part of this is a question of, I guess, whether computational ability of a prodigious character could get you into self-learning, which gets you into possible, outpacing the comprehension, to use George Gilder's word, of man as to what these things are up to. If that translates into a measure of control over, the things that make our lives work, is that not possibly the kind of Terminator complex that some of us think is fiction, some of us are worried about might become our future?
Well, the real danger lies in applications. I really don't think you get to an actual intelligence. You certainly aren't going to with GPT-5 or 6, or Grok 4 for that matter. Grok 10, I don't see how from here. But at the same time, are these fears legitimate? Well, there was a video game about 20 years ago that examined this exact thing. It was an entire series of games called the X Games, ironically enough. And the idea was that these really powerful machines humanity had launched into space to terraform planets got their coding corrupted. And so all of a sudden, they see humanity as a target rather than the purpose of their work, and it's not possible to turn them off. So it becomes this huge war, which makes a great video game, by the way, but it's also a great threat. You could absolutely see some pretty terrible things happen if we're going to have AI-powered autonomous drones in combat, or lots of other things controlling those drones or controlling other aspects of life. So the problem, as is the case with advancing technology in all cases, all throughout our history, is that you have to control it legislatively. You have to enforce America's constitutional civil rights vigorously and in a way that, okay, there will always be technological workarounds. There will always be people who cheat, but you punish them when they do. Which, by the way, is the most exciting thing we're seeing out of the Trump administration now that Vance is saying there are going to be tons of indictments over Russiagate. You know, if you just chop the heads off the people who do wrong, the next group of people doesn't do as much wrong. And that's what we have to do. We have to be an engaged citizen body, refusing to knuckle under to just whatsoever comes. And I think
but that's really the heart of the matter here, Rod, as I see it. I mean, we had recently in the United States Senate, as you know, actually starting in the House, legislation that said, you know, for 10 years, no state will be able to impose any kind of regulation on AI. And I get the argument, well, you don't want 50 states doing this piecemeal. That's pretty crazy. But the idea that nobody will do it because the federal government is clearly not interested in doing any kind of regulation on AI. And, you know, the way it played out in the end, as you know, I'm sure, was the measure that was introduced into the House version of the One Big Beautiful Bill that said, keep your hands off this, states, for 10 years, was ultimately upended 99-1 in the United States Senate. So I think if you can keep up with this, I mean, the legislative process on a good day is, shall we say, rather constipated, to put it mildly. But if it could be possible, some sort of mechanism needs to be done, whether it's legislation or oversight or other kinds of regulation. And that's where it seems as though we're falling down. And I need to take a short break, and when we come back, I'll ask you to just comment on that if you can quickly, and then I want to turn to another very important topic you've addressed recently. Stay tuned for much more with the great free-range mind of Rod Martin. Follow him as well at rodmartin.org. Be right back. Welcome back. We're talking with one of our great friends and colleagues, Rod Martin, about artificial intelligence, continuing a conversation we've had throughout the program. He's rather more sanguine about the possibility that all will be well, that Franken AI could happen, but isn't going to, in part perhaps because we're going to regulate it in such a way as to prevent that. So, Rod, I've expressed concerns about doing that mechanically. Can you allay those as well?
Well, to be fair, I'm not sure that we will regulate it properly, as evidenced by the Pentagon's obsession with drone wingmen and all kinds of semi-autonomous weapon systems. That's actually extremely concerning. That is Terminator, for heaven's sake. So why would we want to do that? I understand why we want to do that. And there's some...
Well, to compete with China is why we're told we must do that.
Well, of course. And the Chinese have no qualms about it at all. If they could build you a clone army like in the second Star Wars prequel, they'd do it tomorrow. So, you know, that doesn't mean we have to match them, but it does mean we have to figure out what they're doing, how they're doing it, ways to counter it. So you've got all these cross currents. But at the end of the day, my point is just we have to be vigilant. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance. And as technology becomes more and more powerful, we're going to have a smaller government that enforces civil rights more seriously, more draconianly in some cases. There just have to be some lines you can't cross. And we haven't figured out what they all are yet. But it isn't that hard because we've been talking about this in science fiction for 80 or 90 years.
Well, figuring out the lines seems to be the lesser of the problems. Figuring out how to impose those lines and enforce them is going to be the challenge. It may be, I mean, we're talking about AI reducing the workforce. It may be that you can get a smaller government with AI, but whether
Well,
it's
and
a
Trump
bigger
has,
brother is the bigger concern.
Trump has deployed an AI tool at Doge that is targeting 50% of all federal regulations to be eliminated by the end of 2025. Not 10 years like everything in Washington seems to be, which means never, but literally this year. And will they achieve that? I don't know, probably not, but they're trying. And that's really encouraging. And if you get rid of the deadwood, there's an incredible opportunity for a leaner, meaner government that is actually responsive to the elective branches. That's all you can ask for.
Yeah. And I guess what you're saying is that if you get that smaller government and it is focused on regulation that matters, maybe they'll be able to regulate artificial intelligence in a way that prevents Franken AI. Speaking of Franken, there are those, Rod Martin, who believe that the advent of the atomic age towards the end of World War II completed that war with the dropping of two bombs, the anniversaries of which were recognized last week, one in Hiroshima and the other in Nagasaki, prompting some, as ever, to complain bitterly that that was done. You wrote a very interesting piece at your platform, rodmartin.org, about this as a justified action. Would you walk us through why it was so, in your estimation?
Well, you know, for me to ever say Truman is right is really kind of hard for me, but nevertheless, the title of the piece is Truman Was Right. And he absolutely was. Look, bottom line is we didn't start the war. So the folks on the right who want to talk about just war theory need to start there. They tend to want to isolate Hiroshima and Nagasaki from the context in which it existed, which is just absurd. We're fighting a defensive war against actually the most brutal, the most savage enemy we faced in World War II. There were days they made Hitler blush, by comparison. Just look at their attack on the Chinese capital, which at the time was Nanking, in which they worked in hand to hand, raping and murdering their way to the center like Genghis Khan. 300,000 dead hand to hand. We killed half that many at Nagasaki and Hiroshima put together. So you say, well, okay, that still doesn't justify it. Well, but it does, because those two cities were key military targets. Hiroshima in particular was a prime military target, but Nagasaki was the most important port in the southern island which we were about to invade. And there's this ongoing argument about, well, we could have just blockaded them and starved them out. Think about what you're saying. The army wasn't going to starve. The elderly and the children and the women were going to starve. You're proposing a blockade as a more humanitarian way to go forward, when in reality it is the least humanitarian way possible. What the bomb did was it shook Tokyo out of its inertia and it forced them to make peace. After Nagasaki, on the 9th, the Japanese decided to surrender on the 10th. So, the claims that, it was the Soviet invasion of Manchuria or whatever. No, it wasn't. It was Nagasaki means they've got more bombs, which actually wasn't true, but they didn't know it. And it put them in a position to rethink core presuppositions, and we got to a peace. And Japan's an infinitely better country because of that.
And Rod, I think it's also important to note that it wasn't just that it brought about the end of the war. It was on our terms. It was unconditional surrender. And that gave rise to the kind of Japan that we have today. And this is one of the things that I'm so frustrated about practically every war we've fought since, which is unconditional surrender is not part of the deal. The decisive victory that we accomplished with those two bombs, sparing, by the way, as you note in your piece, God only knows how many millions of Japanese and American soldiers from certain death. But we also, I think, have to recognize that they created those conditions, and we are desperately in need of decisive victories over today's enemies, including notably, I personally believe, the Sharia supremacists of Iran.
Well, and the other thing
30 seconds back.
other thing that Truman got right, of course, was containment. And I think Trump is doing a good job of containing China at the moment. Certainly a lot better than his predecessor. But yes,
We have to leave it at that, my friend. We are hard out of time. Thank you for joining us. Come back soon. I hope the rest of you will do the same next time. Until then, go forth and multiply.